Welcome to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I'm DT Kane, author of the epic fantasy series The Aggersfar Saga and the spoken books Uprising. Each week, I read from one of my novels, discuss my writing process, answer your questions, and have general discussions about fantasy fiction. It's like a book club, except I do all the work for you. Find show notes, info about all my novels, and much more at dtkane.com. Here's the show. Chapter 10. They rode in silence, heading north on the great road. The thoroughfare was wide and well paved this close to the city, but not expansive enough that each of the three groups could ride side by side while still maintaining space between them. So instead, they proceeded in a strung-out line, Hellar's group at the front, Marla in the middle, and Deliritous bringing up the rear. Baz slumped in his saddle. Already his thighs hurt and his back ached, and they were only 15 minutes into the journey, erstwhile still visible in the rear view. Morosely, Baz wondered whether the cityless who'd been captured by the conservators had walked parts of this road. In all likelihood, he'd come from somewhere north of the Inkwell River, and the only major crossing near erstwhile was the one they'd reach in about 2 weeks' time on the path they currently traveled. Thinking of that cityless brought Tax to mind and what he'd said about the cityless's ravings, that they were a reference to that old child's tale about the enigma and the prophecies he'd written. Sometimes, Baz wished he had such carefree memories from childhood, of a father who'd told him stories at bedtime. But in a way, he was grateful for the calamity that had befallen him early in life, having to witness what grasping at freedom had gotten his brother. As terrible as it had been, at least it had taught Baz early on the reality of his existence, the uselessness of resisting his circumstances. He slouched further forward, which increased the burning pain in his lower back, darkening his mood further still. They reached a slight bend in the road a short time later, and once they took it, erstwhile was gone from view. Marla trotted her horse forward, trailed by her Harbour and Speaker, and pulled up alongside Helar. They were too far away to hear anything, but it was clear that they were conversing with one another in hushed tones. Baz eyed them with a resigned wariness and wondered how long it would be before something unpleasant occurred. "Let's go join them. What do you say?" Deliritous said. Baz glowered at the Torchsire heir. "Doesn't look like they're interested in chatting with you." "Nonsense," Deliritous laughed. "Come along, Baztian. Rocks?" Without awaiting a reply, Deliritous clicked at his horse and urged it forward. Rox followed him without comment, which left Baz alone. Heaving out a sigh, he moved forward as well. He must have dug his heels into his horse's side with too much force, as the animal nearly threw him off. Cursing, he slowed it to a trot and caught up with Deliritous just as he began to address the other two readers, who had stopped their mounts at the sound of Deliritus's approach. "I say, Marla and Helar, a fine day to start the trials, eh?" Helar glanced up at the overcast sky. The edges of Marla's mouth curled up into what might have been a smile, though Baz's spine tingled at the sight. "Deliritous," she said in a tone so friendly that Baz immediately found it concerning. "I don't recall inviting you over." Deliritus's smile faltered, but only for an instant. There were many bad things that could have been said of Deliritous, but he was persistent when he put his mind to a thing. "Ah, sorry," the Torchsire heir said. "I didn't mean to interrupt, but I thought we might talk about our plans for getting to Tome." Now Marla's expression had undoubtedly devolved into a scowl. Helar considered Deliritous with his fish-gray eyes like an illet might consider a day-old bit of porridge, trying to decide whether it had spoiled. Neither one spoke. Deliritous scratched behind one ear, chuckling to break the silence. Look, I know you don't intend to ally with me. It's below a Xavier to ally with a library with the standing of Torchsire, and Kolnar considers us direct competition. I get it. But until we reach Hamlet, we've got to share this road, and once we do, we'll have to decide who's taking which way to Tome. I thought we could at least be civil about it. We'll be seeing one another for years to come once the trials are over. Marla snorted derisively, but Helar tilted his head to one side, as if at least considering the possibility that the lumpy mush before him hadn't lost all possible use. I find your effort at diplomacy intriguing, Helar said. His voice was a monotone, as if he'd never experienced a true emotion in his life. But underlying any diplomatic gesture is a desire to bargain. What could a Torchsire offer a Xavier? Deliritous shrugged. You're right. I haven't got much, but you know who does? Hellar tilted his head to the other side, moving it in an unnaturally slow arc. His pale eyes never left Deliritous. Who? He finally asked, voice evoking a feeling like that in the air when a storm lay just beyond the horizon. Xavier Library, Deliritous said. Ever since their victory 3 years ago, their fortunes have been looking up. For the first time, Hellar's face showed the slightest bit of reaction, his mouth turning downward. Xavier Library is but a lichen on the edifice of Xavier Tower, he said. Maybe, Deliritous said, but it's creeping higher and higher each year. My father shows me the figures. My good man, you'll need friends at the table in the coming years if you're to maintain your position. With his head still tilted, Hellar tapped a single finger against his lips. You have authority to commit your father to such a bargain? Hellar, what are you? The Xavier heir raised his other hand to silence Marla. The stare she gave him would have melted steel, though Hellar didn't even seem to notice it. My father will abide by any bargain I strike, yes, Deliritous said. Baz raised his eyebrows at that. He was almost certain Duke Octavianal had given his son no such latitude. Once more, he had to begrudgingly give Deliritous some credit for how steadily he'd asserted that lie. Terms? Hellar asked. Oh, nothing onerous, Deliritous said. I certainly don't expect you to let me win. Just that we keep treatment of one another to a level of mild contempt, rather than that of blood enemies, and that we not try to murder one another's speakers and harbors like a bunch of animals. We go our separate ways at Hamlet, and stay away from each other until Tome. I'll even agree to be the one who spends an extra day in Hamlet, while one of you takes the road through the Emerald Forest, and the other heads off to the Reach before I follow one of you. And what of when we reach Tome? Same terms, unless we each discover the same spoken book. Then we revert back to trial standard rules. No killing one another, but anything else goes. Hellar continued to tap his lips for quite a while before finally saying, Very well. What? Snarled Marla. You can't agree to that, Hellar. I said, very well, Marla. Hellar's voice cut like a blade through cold flesh, and Marla fell silent, though her eyes still burned with rage. Ride with us, Deliritous. Thank you, Deliritous said, tipping his plumed hat to Hellar. The three speakers eased their horses into a slow trot and rode off down the road together, leaving their respective speakers and harbors to trail behind. Baz could hardly believe it. Had Deliritous actually just done something useful? After that, the first few days of the trip actually weren't so bad. Sleeping on the ground was awful, as Baz seemingly managed to position his spine directly atop a pile of rocks each time he slept. But Deliritous proved he wasn't a complete fool. He insisted that Rox keep watch each night to ensure there was no foul play from the others. Initially, Baz had thought this a fine idea. Helar might have been appeased by Deliritous' offer, but Baz had his doubts about Marla, and anything that upped the chances of her staying away from him while he slept seemed prime thinking. But after a few hours that first night of staring up at the night sky, listening to Rox hum ballads from Enigma to pass the time, Baz wanted to bash the Harbour over the head for some peace and quiet. That there seemed to be a sort of quiet sadness in the Harbour's music only agitated Baz all the more. But aside from those comparatively minor discomforts, all 9 of them stuck together in relative harmony. They camped separately from each other at night, but in close proximity. Deliritous made small talk with Helar during the day, and even Marla seemed to have contained her inhumanity to a reasonable level. At least, no one woke up to a slit throat or a bashed-in skull. Baz had even put the hood of Lyanna's cloak up a few times when the wind had become particularly biting, and no one had said a thing to him about it. Altogether, it was turning out a million times better than he'd expected. On the evening of the 4th night, they camped by a small pond. Baz was brushing down their horses when Trunnel wandered over to the pond to fill his waterskin. "How's it going, Trunnel?" Baz asked. The influencer gave a start, dropping his waterskin into the pond. Mumbling a curse, he retrieved it, then cast a glance toward Helar's camp before looking back to Baz. He shrugged. Baz fumed. "Can't even talk to me without your speaker's permission?" Trunnel's face darkened. "I can speak if I wish." "Right," Baz said, going back to brushing his horse. "When your lips aren't stuck together with Helar's boot black." "What did you say?" Baz lifted his head back up from the brushing, ready to clarify that he'd been commenting on Trunnel kissing his reader's boots. But his eyes fell to the brand on Trunnel's forehead, and he bit back the remark. Trunnel didn't deserve Baz's disdain. He was just trying to get by, same as Baz. In fact, Trunnel was ordinarily more cordial than most toward Baz. Jumpiness was out of character for the influencer. Burning pages. Trunnel was probably just as worried about finding Rox's razor embedded in his skull at night as Baz was about finding Marla's knife at his throat. "Nothing," muttered Baz. "Just bitter about being dragged out here, I suppose." Trunnel harumphed with what might have been understanding and filled his waterskin. As he walked back to his camp, he passed right by Baz and said in a low voice, "Maybe you won't be able to understand me through all the shoe polish, but I wouldn't sleep so easy at night if I were you. Speaker Xavier has never had any qualms over dishonesty when it suits him." Trunnel hoisted the waterskin over his shoulder and departed without another word, leaving Baz to look after him, gulping down a sudden lump in his throat. In all likelihood, Trunnel had just said that to get back at him for the earlier insult. Still, Baz seemed to find even more sharp stones than usual that night, and Rox's humming seemed particularly loud. He hardly got any sleep. The next day began like the others before, overcast but uneventful, and it likely would have remained that way if only Baz could have kept his mouth shut. They stopped at a brook a few hours into the day's journey to let their mounts drink. Marla had taken her speaker and Harbour a short distance away from the rest of them to cast a spell for food. Baz had watched her do it several times already since they'd set out. Her speaker, mad as he seemingly was, constantly wringing his hands and licking his lips, appeared capable of growing any vegetable imaginable. Baz had seen him conjure carrots, cabbages, and even a few tomatoes, the sprouts springing from the ground and maturing to full-grown plants in a matter of seconds after just a few repeated words. But this morning he slipped up. Marla must have been planning to produce all the food she'd need for the remainder of the journey in a single spell, for this reading went on for substantially longer than any of the prior ones Baz had witnessed. She was nearing the end, and a tomato plant taller than rocks had wound its way up the side of a nearby tree. But then Marla stumbled over a syllable, and her speaker, Retch was his name, shot a surprised glance at her, faltering in his pronunciation. The spell fizzled, Retch's skin breaking out in hives, and the tomato plant crumbling to dust. "You idiot!" roared Marla, backhanding Retch across the face. The man collapsed to the ground, crying out like a small child. Marla kicked him in the gut. He curled into a ball, whimpering. She lifted her leg for another kick. Deliritous and Helar seemed entirely oblivious to the scene, and Marla's Harbour was actually grinning. Trunnel was off doing something or other for Helar. Rox was down by the water with the horses. He appeared to be shaking his head, but was making no move to intervene. Baz was momentarily struck by a severe bout of life-threatening stupidity. "Oh, come on," he shouted. "You're the one who messed up the reading." Every set of eyes in the camp turned to him at once. Deliritus's seemed ready to fall right out of his head, and now it seemed that Rox was shaking his head at Baz. But all Baz could focus on was Marla. He was like a doe startled by a wolf, completely incapable of movement. The female speaker smiled at him and sauntered toward him. As she did, she drew a knife from her belt. The same one the Cityless had nearly used to kill Deliritous, some faraway part of Baz's mind realized. Distantly, he heard Deliritous give a cry of protest. Marla stopped within arm's reach of Baz. "What did you say, little speaker?" She waved the blade beneath Baz's nose. His eyes followed it back and forth. He considered apologizing, or even groveling, but finally decided that it was opening his mouth that had gotten him into this. Perhaps staying silent would keep him breathing. "Nothing to say now," she said, still smiling. "You know, where I come from, we'd cut out your tongue and feed it to you. And then we'd hang you by your ankles and start removing fingers, then hands, then ears and nose, until pretty soon you're a mute, but still very much alive, piece of—" "Enough!" For a moment, Baz thought there'd been an earthquake, but then he realized Rox had spoken. The Harbour was now only a few paces away, razor in hand. Deliritous was at his shoulder. Marla eyed the Harbour, her smile growing sweet as a moldy cake. She slid the knife back into the sheath on her belt. "You really should control your property, Deliritous," she said. For just a moment, she looked in Helar's direction. The Xavier heir gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. Marla snorted, then spun and returned to her Harbour and speaker, the latter still writhing on the ground in pain. "Young Baztian," Deliritous said once she'd gone, "what were you thinking?" Baz didn't answer. His body was so full with the adrenaline of terror that he barely even heard Deliritous. But through the fog of horror clouding his senses, a single thought occurred to Baz. Helar had made no effort at all to intervene. Whether that was because he was as duplicitous as Trunnel said, or because he had no more control over Marla than anyone could have over a rabid dog, Baz didn't know. And it didn't matter. What he did know was the dread he'd felt upon leaving erstwhile had returned to the pit of his stomach, and this time he didn't think it'd be going away. All right, welcome to episode 9, everyone. It's Thursday, March 10th, 2022, as I record this, and it's good to be back. I know you all had an episode to listen to last week, but that's because I batch recorded a couple before I left for my vacation in Chicago last week. So it feels like forever since I sat down to record, and it's nice to be back chatting with all of you about fantasy, etc. Just real quick, Chicago was a lot of fun. I shared a couple of photos in my newsletter last week, which I wrote from my Airbnb up in Andersonville, which is about 20 minutes north of downtown. It's kind of a trendy neighborhood with lots of bars and restaurants. It was a good time there. Had a lot of amazing food and drink, probably too much of both, but I guess that's what vacation is for. A couple of quick highlights there. I went to Goose Island Brewery's tap room. Had some rare varieties of their famous barrel-aged Bourbon County Stout. So for those craft beer fans out there, you probably know what I'm talking about. Also went to this great Mediterranean restaurant called Abba. ABA. I'm pretty sure they called it Abba, but I don't totally recall. But that was really good. If you're in Chicago, definitely recommend you try going there for dinner. Got this lamb ragu hummus with pita bread. It was great. So if you like Greek or Mediterranean food, definitely go check them out next time you're in Chicago. And I even got some outlining on part 4 of the Spoken Books Uprising done. In fact, I'm nearly done with that outline. Probably going to start drafting the book soon. So that's exciting. I haven't actually done any writing almost a couple months now. I've been editing and working on the podcast here and releasing books, which is all important, but it'll be exciting to get back to creating some new stories. Final little update here. If you subscribe to the newsletter, you know this already. And just head over to dtkane.com if you would like to sign up for it. But Declaimer's Discovery, which is part 2 of the Spoken Books Uprising, had its cover release this past Friday, and it is a beautiful cover. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but I really do like it. I encourage you to head over to the website and to check it out. You can, of course, pre-order the book now if you so choose. It does release on April 15th. If you think you're going to read it, I would ask you to consider pre-ordering it now. Those pre-orders help boost my ranking in the charts on launch day, which helps with visibility, because the higher up on the charts, the more people are likely to see it. So if you think you're going to end up ordering it at some point, consider just hitting order now. I'll leave an order link in the show notes. Right. But if you don't order it, that's fine too. We'll be reading Declaimer's Discovery together here once we finish up reading the Acktus Trials on the podcast. So never fear. It's all coming at you for free here eventually as well. So why don't we jump in here to our analysis of Chapter 10. We've got, there's 3 kind of primary scenes here in the chapter, plus we get kind of this glum introduction from Baz, which we'll go over in a minute. Just to start, I think, last week, or maybe it was 2 episodes ago, I recognize that, sometimes when I'm pointing stuff out, I'm kind of just like praising my own writing, which, it's my podcast. I'm allowed to say nice things about my about my own book sometimes. But I will give you a little bit of the opposite here. I'm not in love with chapter 10. It's not necessarily, that's not to say it's terrible or anything, but it's just not one of the best chapters in the book. A little behind the curtain look here. This chapter wasn't even in the original draft. Well, it was, but it was just a placeholder. I just wrote myself a note, something like travel scene with the other readers here, and then I moved on because I couldn't think of anything to put there. But I did want my readers to have an opportunity to meet the other competitors. in more detail than the brief glances we got at the torture scene with the cityless. And I guess I did that here in chapter 10, but I do find the chapter a bit slow. Looking back, I probably could have done a better job on this one, but I don't know. Maybe that's also just because I know that I kind of just put this in here as a transition chapter, and maybe it doesn't read that way for others who don't know that, or maybe I just ruined the chapter. Maybe no one was thinking this, and no, I've told you, but there you go. And that's kind of the writing life. There's always something you could do better. But eventually you got to release that story out into the wild and move on to the next one. I guess there's this philosophy you should work on until it's perfect, right? But I don't want to, write one book every 5 years. I've got lots of stories to write. That pace doesn't work for me. So, inevitably there are going to be little things that I could probably improve in each story. But, I don't want perfect to be the enemy of, good enough, or, I don't settle for just good enough, but if it's really good, that's fine. I'm not going to spend 2 more years getting it to like 1% better. So there you go. And there's also this saying in the writing community, if you don't look back on something you wrote a year or two ago and cringe a little, you're probably doing something wrong, because that means your writing isn't improving. So I guess I can take this as a positive sign and improvement and carry on here. So there you go. Right, so we get this little, this introduction here. Baz is trotting away from erstwhile with the rest of the party. He's already just downright morose, right? Thinking about how he's traveling on the same road that dead cityless had traveled on. I'm walking in the he's basically saying, I'm walking in the footsteps of a dead man, because Baz is kind of worried that he's going to die on this journey here too. And we see how jaded he is about life too. I mean, we've gotten a pretty good sense of this already, but he's like, sometimes I wish I had fond childhood memories, like how his brother had these memories of their father telling him bedtime stories. But actually, he says he's glad of the awful experience he had when he was so young, which was seeing, obviously, Tax getting his eyes ripped out, right? What does he say here? It had taught him the reality of his existence, the uselessness. Jeez. When another behind the scenes here, when I was narrating the chapter, I must have messed this line up like 3 or 4 times. I said usefulness here every time. The actual line is, it had taught him the reality of his existence, the uselessness of resisting his circumstances. Jeez. Baz's attitude has gone from bad to worse here with his view on things. But I guess maybe part of us wonders too, or maybe you should be wondering, if put in the right situation, does Baz truly feel this way? How it's useless resisting. I mean, he didn't stand there all apathetic when Deliritous was about to get killed by that cityless. He took action, and he certainly isn't afraid to stand up to Deliritous, it seems, right? And even maybe he's not outwardly critical of other readers, but certainly inwardly he's very critical of them. So he's certainly not someone who is just looking to grovel in front of others. So for all the defeatist self-talk Baz has, he does kind of seem to be a man of action when it really comes down to it. So let's see how that develops as the story continues to unfold. And I've broken the rest of the chapter down here into 3 sections. This first section I'm deeming, did Deliritous just do something useful? And I think that's actually exactly what Baz says at the end of this section. But yeah, Deliritous shows some cojones here, right? He sees Hellar, and so they're all three of their groups, Hellar, Marla, and Deliritous, they've each got their Harbour and speaker. So the three trios, they're all kind of traveling apart from each other. But as soon as they turn the corner, erstwhile's out of view, Hellar and Marla, get together and they start whispering to one another, and to this point, Deliritous has kind of been a bit foppish, right? A bit of a wimp, but not here. He sort of just butts in, right? And he's not going to let these other two just gang up on him without trying something. And he's realistic too. So he's not just ignorant going up here. He knows what he's doing, even if he doesn't come out and say it. He understands neither Xavier nor Kolnar is probably interested in a true alliance with Torchsire. Xavier is so far above Torchsire. What do they care? And Kolnar and Torchsire Library are kind of competitors. They're both kind of lower on the library food chain. So they're not going to work together either. But he shows, Deliritous has some smarts here. Remember, he is the heir to a library. Presumably he's been trained as such. We saw he's been doing speaking lessons with his uncle back a few chapters ago, so he's probably getting training in other things, and so a bit of a savvy move here. He offers some political advantage to Hellar. He says, what does Torchsire have to offer you? Well, not much, but Xgall Library, they are what does Hellar say? He calls them, they're lichen on Xavier Tower. And Deliritous is like, well, maybe, but that lichen is creeping taller every year. You're going to need some support here in the coming years to keep your influence. And for those of you who have forgotten, Xgall Library, only mentioned briefly, but they're the library who won the trials a few years ago. And they found this great spoken book that helps the illits grow potato plants right in their houses, so they can just have their own little gardens, and that really boosted their standing because all of the illits wanted to go buy that spell from the readers at Xgall Library. So Deliritous is like, well, I'll throw my support, my library support behind you if you you don't kill me on the trials here. He's even got the guts to lie, right? He says his father will recognize any promises he makes, even though Baz is pretty certain Duke Octavianal told Deliritous no such thing. So, Deliritous has taken some initiative here. There does also seem to be an interesting dynamic between Marla and Helar. She's certainly not showing him any respect. It doesn't really seem. She's kind of like, sneering and incredulous with what he's doing. But she does stop talking when he interrupts her or motions for her to be silent. Maybe the two of them had some sort of deal worked out already, and now Deliritous is jeopardizing that somehow. Marla obviously is not happy when Hellar decides to accept Deliritus's offer here. And we already know she's someone we don't want to mess with. So maybe getting this tenuous alliance with Hellar isn't all it seems to be cracked up to be, if it means Marla wanting to get back at Deliritous. So, probably some foreshadowing of some not so great things to come here. And then really the last little bit here. Did you notice how Deliritous slipped in this term into his truce that, they aren't to harm one another's harbors or speakers? Hellar asks him for his terms. Hellar's got his monotonous voice. Terms? What are your terms? Nothing onerous. Not try to murder one another's speakers and harbors like a bunch of animals. Well, let's just act like human beings. Is that asking too much? So, is Deliritous just protecting his assets though, or does he have a bit of heart hidden under his foolish giant hat here? I don't know. We'll have to see. We've seen some signs already that maybe Deliritous, obviously he still has slaves, but maybe he's not nearly as bad as some of the other readers. So we'll have to keep that in mind. All right, so the next part here I've dubbed Bitter as Boot Black. And I just said this is kind of a tenuous alliance, it seems, here with Helar, and we kind of see almost immediately that we shouldn't be putting too much stock in it, right? We have this quick scene of Baz talking with Trunnel, who is Helar's speaker. He was the influencer who was trying to help get the Cityless to answer the torturer's questions back in Chapter 4. And initially Baz is kind of being antagonistic with him, accusing him of kissing Helar's boots, because Trunnel kind of glances over to Helar's camp, like he's looking for permission to talk to Baz. Though, is that really what Trunnel was doing? Because, hold that for just 1 second. But so, Baz quickly realizes, Trunnel's probably just as concerned about getting killed as Baz is. So, he steps back on his insult, really realizing he's probably opened his mouth when he shouldn't have, which is a problem Baz will consistently have here throughout the novel. He's got a mouth that likes to run, which is funny because he makes fun of Deliritous for that, but Baz kind of has the same problem. What is he saying? Trunnel's probably worried about getting his head chopped off by Rox's razor or something, something like that. So. But then, so Trunnel then drops his bomb on his way back, which is, this actually, is this why he was looking back towards Helar's camp? Because he actually wanted to say something to Baz that he didn't want Helar to hear. Helar's got no issue with dishonesty when it suits him. Baz kind of, murmurs this to him ominously and then walks away. Is Trunnel just getting back at Baz for this earlier insult about kissing Helar's boots, or is he trying to help him? Don't know. So, but obviously we're seeing here that this is not going to be a happy marriage between Deliritous and the other competitors here. It seems pretty likely. And then our final section of the chapter here. Dubbed, "First we'd feed you your tongue, then start removing fingers." We close the chapter here with another look at Marla, and it's not any better than what we saw earlier, right? She gives us kind of a front row seat to how poorly some readers treat their speakers. She makes this mistake reading this spell, and that makes the spell, that messes the spell up. They're trying to make this huge, I think it's a tomato plant, right? And then she slips up, and the speaker mispronounces it, and the whole thing collapses. And what does she do? She punches her speaker for her mistake, and then he, kind of collapses in on himself, and then she kicks him in the gut while he's down. Helar and Deliritous don't even react to this, which kind of shows how desensitized they are to, this kind of treatment. But what does Baz do? Another example here of Baz kind of opening his mouth where he probably shouldn't, though at least here he's opening it because he's got this innate sense of right. Yeah, that we've already seen it several times throughout the book. Of course, Baz doesn't see it that way. He calls it a severe bout of life-threatening stupidity. He yells Marla for to stop it. Geez, you were the one who messed up the reading. Don't punch him. And of course, Marla doesn't care for that being spoken to like that by someone who she views as being so far below her. She kind of pulls out the knife here, which some part of Baz's mind realizes is the same knife that she had down in the torture chamber, and the one that the Cityless grabbed to try to kill Deliritous. And she starts explaining to him in these pretty graphic terms, right, about what she would do to him if given the chance. And who knows, maybe she would start doing that too if of all people, who steps in? It's Brox. Rox to the rescue, our giant protector here. Enough, he says. He's got his razor out, right? So Rox is kind of quickly turning into a bit of a teddy bear here, right? Well, maybe I shouldn't say right, but what do you think? Baz noted earlier in the chapter that he hums these sad Enigman ballads to himself at night when he's on guard duty. And did you catch that Rox was also the only person who kind of had any negative reaction to Marla kicking her speaker? Baz said he looked over, and it looked like Rox was shaking his head at the scene. And now he's potentially saved Baz from Marla's wrath. So Rox definitely someone to keep an eye on here. He, we certainly made him out as a kind of just the bloodthirsty giant bodyguard in the beginning, and there's definitely a lot more depth to this guy. And that's the chapter. Really, we're left very much doubting the benefit of this truce Deliritous brokered with Helar at the beginning. It did show, Deliritous not completely useless, but you have to wonder, where this truce is going, and it's probably not anywhere good. And as Baz points out, even if Helar isn't lying, even if he intends to keep to these terms, he probably doesn't seem to have any true control over Marla. Well, either that or maybe they are just working together behind Deliritous' back. Either way, it's not going to end well. We see Marla look at Helar, and he shakes his head there at the end of the chapter. What does that mean? Are they waiting for something else? Or, maybe Helar does have more control over Marla than Baz thinks? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see what happens next week. All right, so bit of a shorter week here, but next week is going to be a doozy and likely a longer one, so stay tuned. We're going to read chapters 11 and 12, and these might be some of the most exciting chapters in the book, so I'm definitely looking forward to sharing those with you, and I hope you are looking forward to hearing me read them to you. So for homework, I didn't want to do too much here because there's a lot that happens, and I didn't want to give you too many spoilers here. But, we saw Deliritous take some initiative here in Chapter 10. Baz is going to take some serious initiative in Chapters 11 and 12, and he's also going to, the initiative he takes is going to answer a question some of you have probably been wondering about since the beginning of the book. So keep an eye out for that. And then Deliritous has a certain, reaction to something that Baz does, and what do you think? Was this a predictable reaction or a stupid reaction? Maybe a little of both? I don't know. Let me know what you think. And I think that's all the homework I'm going to give you this week. I just want you to just enjoy these two chapters. So, of course, you can enjoy every chapter without doing your homework because I do it all for you in the following episode. That's the beauty of D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I do all the work for you. All right. Didn't get any questions this week. I don't know if that's because I was out in Chicago or what, but definitely keep sending in your questions. That's one of my most favorite parts of the podcast, actually, is answering those questions. Really, I feel like I'm having a conversation with you guys anyway, but I really feel like it's a conversation when I get some questions to answer. So send those in, dtkane@dtkane.com, or I am at dtkaneauthor on both Twitter and Facebook. You can drop me a question there, either of those places. All right, this week's quest. I would like you to send me a curse phrase based on something bad happening to books. So that's how we curse in the Spoken Books Uprising universe, right? Bloody burning pages, or torn pages, or spilled ink. Those are the kind of curse words that that we use in this world. And Baz is going to be in lots of situations coming up that call for cursing. So I would love to hear what some of you all come up with. We'll make this even a bit more of a competition this week. So I'm going to give 3 experience each to my 3 favorite submissions. So not everyone is going to get experience for this one, just my 3 top picks. So get creative. Let me know. Give me some ideas here. So that'll be fun. Hopefully a lot of you participate in that. All right, and then we'll close with a quote. As always, this week's comes from the incomparable Robert Jordan, author of the Wheel of Time series. This one is from The Dragon Reborn. does it make you brave to stick your hand in a bear's mouth? Would you do it again just because you didn't die? That's a good one. I'm not sure if that is quite applicable to this week's chapter, though. I guess Baz certainly doesn't view himself as a hero, but he is going to need some courage here in the coming chapters, though he also has a tendency to kind of do stupid things sometimes, as does Deliritous. So some of the themes of this quote ring true. Just because you got away with doing something really dangerous, are you brave or are you stupid for doing that? So interesting. I think we'll certainly see circumstances of that in chapters to come. So keep that in mind. And that's all. So until next time, this has been D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Future Dan, Chapter 10-3. Thanks for listening to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. If you liked today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified whenever new episodes become available. If you'd like to listen to back episodes or review the show notes, visit dtkane.com/podcast. D.T. Kane's novels are available for purchase at most major online retailers, or you can purchase directly from his website at www.dtkane.com/books. You can receive a free short story and sign up for D.T. Kane's mailing list at dtkane.com/email-signup. If you'd like to connect, you can find D.T. Kane on Facebook at D.T. Kane Author or Twitter at D.T. Kane Author, or send D.T. Kane an email at dtkane@dtkane.com. See you next week.